final rule. It's called pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And it's the most personal chapter in the book. It's a lot about my daughter. And my daughter was very ill when she was a kid, but particularly when she was a teenager. She had a very terrible time of it. She had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and when she was between the ages of 14 and 16, it first destroyed her hip, which had to be replaced, and then it destroyed the ankle on her other leg, which had to be replaced. And she walked around for 2 years on broken legs, and she was taking massive doses of opiates and could hardly stay awake. And she had this advanced autoimmune disease, which produced all sorts of other symptoms that were just as bad as the joint degeneration, but which are harder to describe. And so it's just bloody brutal. And as a test of your faith, there's almost nothing that's more direct than a serious illness inflicted upon an innocent child, right? And so the chapter's a meditation on that, and also on, what to do in a situation like that, because everyone is going to have a situation like that in some sense, because you'll be faced with illness in the people that you love and in crisis. And so it's a practical guide to coping with those sorts of things. And one of the things you do when you're overwhelmed by crisis is you shorten your time frame. It's like you can't think about next month. Maybe you can't even bloody well think about next week, or maybe not even tomorrow. Because now is just so overwhelming that that's all there is. It's like, and that's what you do. You cut your time frame back until you can cope with it. And if it's not the next week that you see how to get through, then it's the next day. And if it's not the next day, then it's the next hour. And if it's not the next hour, then it's the next minute. And people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they think they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, nose her a bit. And then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times. And maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. There's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, is this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist. And maybe we could make the world into a better place, And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And that's the end of 12 Rules for Life. Thank you.
We're made in the image of God. So,
yes.
And we have Adam is granted the right and the responsibility to subdue and to name and to put everything in its proper place, right? And Eve to bring to Adam's attention the things that remain outside his purview. And those are real things.
Yeah.
So human beings have something real to do.
Yeah.
And so then you might say, real and important. And you might say, well, what makes something real? Now, this is a hard question. You know, and the materialist answer is, well, let's say sensory evidence. But I don't think that's right. I think what makes things real is death and limitation. Like if you're playing a game, if you're playing a video game, a first-person shooter game, it's a game because when you get killed, you're not dead.
Yeah.
It's not a game when death is in the in the offings. Yeah. And so, and what we're doing as human beings is real.
Yeah.
And the price we pay for reality, it looks to me like the price we pay for reality is death.
Yeah.
And it's real. Yeah. And so that's going to have these consequences. And I think, you know, you highlighted the most, at least arguably the most painful of those consequences. You know, people think there's nothing worse than death. I think, well, you have a limited imagination, first of all, because there are many things worse than death. And one of the things that might well be worse than death is the death of a child.
Yes.
You know, I think it's a very rare parent who wouldn't happily substitute themselves in a contest of death with their child, you know, if in a heartbeat even. And so now, why does God demand that price of reality? I think it has something to do with the fact that we do actually have something important to do. You know, we're supposed to be establishing the kingdom of heaven, of God on earth. And that's hard, like actually hard. And the eternal enemies of that are sin and death. Yes. And those are real. And fighting them is real. And when you're in a real battle, there's real death and there's real evil. And that's brutal, but that's the price of reality. Now, then the question is, well, under what conditions is that price worth paying? And I think that's what the biblical stories actually attempt to explicate. You know, the offering to Abraham, it isn't a life of ease. It's not a life of comfort. And it's not a life of hedonistic gratification. Mm-hmm. It's something like a life of adventure. Yeah. And I would also say there's probably no adventure without death.
Yes.
You know, if you think about the movies that people watch, people will go watch secret agent movies and superhero movies. Yeah. The secret agent movies in some ways work better because the person is mortal and the depth of their commitment is measured by their willingness to put their life on the line. Yeah. So I don't know, it looks to me like this is a very weird thing, but it looks to me like without death, there's no reality.
Yeah.
And then you might say, well, that's a price not worth paying. It's like, that's an understandable argument, especially that's the sort of thing you ask yourself when a child dies. But then you think you said something also that bears on that. Well, you said the depth of your grief is proportionate to the magnitude of your love.
Yes.
And so you might say, well, how could God constitute a world made such that a child could die? And then you think, well, if you have a child and the child dies and you grieve, the grief is an indication of the magnitude of the loss. And so the fact that you grieve, that's a testament to the value of the life, even though it was truncated.
Yes.
So your grief is the proof of the value of the life.
Right.
And so what that means, as far as I can tell, is that grief itself is the justification of life in the face of death.
But then there's the afterlife. And I believe in the afterlife. And I believe in heaven. And I believe in it more than I've ever believed. I've always been a student of heaven as a Christian, and the Bible speaks so much of heaven. But when my son went to be there, I wanted to know more about it. And as you read the Bible, you realize that heaven is a real place for real people to do real things. You know, Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. And heaven in the Bible is pictured as a city. It's pictured as a country. It's pictured as a paradise. The Bible tells us we'll eat in heaven. We'll be reunited with loved ones in heaven. We'll be active. And then one day heaven comes to earth in what we call the millennium. Heaven and earth become one. So I believe very strongly in that. Now, can I prove it? Well,
what do you think that means? So let's delve in. That's such a hard topic. Let's delve into that a little bit. Yeah. So Christ tells his followers to be perfect like his Father in heaven is perfect. Yes. And there's continuous injunctions in the Gospels to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
That's central to the Lord's Prayer. And there's an idea that lurks in the opening chapters of Genesis about the reestablishment of the eternal Eden. And so it looks like there's an insistence that the goal of the true religious striver is to establish paradise on earth, something like that. And I mean, that can take some vicious utopian spins that are very counterproductive, but that's the underlying idea. Now, I don't know how to reconcile that with the idea of, so that's heaven. That's the heaven that people are striving to bring about when they aim upward properly and walk up Jacob's ladder. And I don't know how to reconcile that with notions of the afterlife with regard to death. We have the strange insistence on the part of Christianity, too, that Christ defeated death and evil, in spite of the evidence that death and evil continue in this world unabated. And so that there's a paradox there. Like, how do you reconcile in your own mind the insistence that part of the Christian moral pattern is to perfect the world and to raise the material up to the heavenly with the notion of the afterlife and immortality? I know that's a terrible question, but no, I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
Well, I think coming back to the statement of Jesus, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Bottom line, nobody can be perfect. We fall short. So the point of that to me is we sin against God. Now, some of us sin more than others, but we all sin. We had a little Halloween event at our church, and we had one of those, the bell where you hit the thing with the hammer. And so I've hit that and hit the bell in the past. So I got it out and I hit it and I got so close, but I never got it. I think I spent a half hour trying to ring that bell and I fell short. So God has set perfection. That's the standard for humanity. Well, who can be perfect? Answer no. And that's where Jesus comes in, because the Bible says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So going back to the Garden of Eden, our first parents sinned. And because they ate of the forbidden fruit, which, by the way, the Bible never says was an apple. I don't know where the apple came from. But it was something that was very attractive. If you ate of it, it would give you this supernatural wisdom, knowing good and evil. Supposedly, that's what the lie was. They ate of the fruit and sin came into the world. So if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the forbidden fruit, we wouldn't die. Mm-hmm. If they had not eaten of the forbidden fruit, we wouldn't age and get sick. If they hadn't eaten of the forbidden fruit, I'd probably have hair right now, right? So these are the effects of aging. But here's the thing, is that the earth, life on earth is not everything. This is the before life, then there's the afterlife. C.S. Lewis, what did he call it? He had a phrase for it that he used often in his writings about Shadowlands. That's right, Shadowlands. So the idea of Lewis was that what we're seeing now at its very best, take the greatest moment of your life with your friends, having a meal, enjoying life together, maybe a beautiful sunset. It's a shadow of greater things to come. It's not like earth is the real thing and heaven is the imitation. It's actually, according to the Bible, the other way around. Heaven is the real thing. See, going back to Abraham, he was looking for a city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. He was looking for something he never found in all of his journeys. And I think it was a longing for the afterlife. And we all have that longing. And one day when we get to heaven, I think we'll see that the greatest experiences of earth were only a shadow of greater things to come. So I believe very firmly in a real heaven where I'll do real things and I'll be reunited with my son.
America's healthcare system is lacking in any real care. Insurance companies regularly deny progressive treatment options, primary care physicians refuse to order comprehensive lab work, and the standards of care lag years behind the leading research. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health represents a paradigm shift in how we approach medicine. The premier health optimization platform, Merrick Health empowers you to maximize your longevity and performance with the confidence that comes from having experts in your back pocket. They offer cutting-edge diagnostic labs, concierge health coaching, and expert clinical oversight. They help you achieve your health and fitness goals by leveraging data-driven lifestyle and nutrition recommendations, along with supplement and prescription treatment options. If you're listening to this show, then you're probably a proponent of taking your health into your own hands. That's why we've teamed up with Merrick Health to offer a turnkey optimization package designed for those who want to maximize their performance and longevity with the most elaborate testing on the market. You'll receive extensive lab work, thorough lab reports, video calls with Merrick's health experts, and expedited onboarding. Go to merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson to get the same panel and medical oversight I get and save 10% at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson at checkout.
Well, it's clear that when you have those great experiences, that they're, first of all, the fact that we can have a category that's great experiences indicates that there's some commonality between those experiences, right? The peak moments of your life when you're at the apex, right? It's all the same symbolic language. And that obviously is emblematic of something that unites all of those episodes, right? And you could call that heavenly, and you could think about it as an echo of a place. I mean, I still don't understand the relationship between that. And I think that's all true, by the way. And I mean, I've seen too that Jacob's ladder, God is the ineffable pinnacle of this endless upward spiral that's Jacob's ladder. And he's ineffable in part because maybe you have an ideal and you take 10 steps toward it and now you're near it, but then you see that the true ideal is yet farther than that. And so you reconstruct your vision of the ideal and you progress towards that. And then when you get there, you see that that's only a shadow of the true ideal. And I don't think there's any bottom to the abyss, so to speak, on the malevolent side. I don't think there's any pinnacle to upward. And there is a vision of heaven in that. But I still struggle to understand the relationship between that and the moral requirement of people to aim towards. One of the things my wife and I have been practicing, we got much better at this. She just about died 3 years ago, and so did I. And close enough so that as far as we were both concerned, we were either dead or wanted to be. And for a very long time. And anyways, that didn't happen. And so we were pretty happy about the fact that each other were around before that, but much happier afterwards. And we've really never forgotten that, even moment to moment. And one of the things that we've decided to practice is to notice when we're interacting with one another in a manner that's optimal. And it's interesting because I've known her since she was 8. Wow. So we were childhood friends and we were good friends. And I can remember what she was like when she was a little kid, and she was an excellent little kid, and she was very popular and very much fun to be around. And I can see in her that spirit coming back to life, very frequently. And so one of the things we've learned to do is to notice when that's happening, right? And first of all, to notice, second, to appreciate it, but then to see if we could practice extending the amount of time that we're in that state. Yeah. And you can get much better at that if you practice, just like you get better at everything that you practice. And that is something I used to counsel my clients as well to do this, is if they were depressed, is, to monitor their mood. And then to see times when they were less depressed, because even someone who's even quite depressed still varies. So you say, well, sometimes you're going to be on the brink of suicide, but other times you're going to forget that you're depressed. You got to see what you're doing when things are better. And then you have to start doing those things more. Right. So you can practice that. And so you can take these little visions of paradise that you get in life and you can expand them with practice. And then I think as you do that, inside that window, then another window opens up, or another door. That's the door you knock on, right? Another door opens, and then you can expand that. And I don't think that is a paradisal vision. I don't think there is any end to that. But I still don't understand the relationship between that, even theologically, and the idea of life after death. I can see that it means life eternal, because what happens in those moments of transcendence is that you do get a sense of the value of life that's eternal, right? So you're living in eternity. Mm-hmm. But as I said, I still don't understand the relationship between that and post-death existence. And I haven't found anything biblically that's helped me clarify that. Still a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. It has something to do with heaven descending and the material world ascending and some vision of the ultimate unity of those things, but I can't make any more heads or tails of it than that. How did that become clearer to you, say, in the aftermath of your son's death?
Well, that's one of the biggest questions of all. What happens after we die?
what do you want in your life? It's a very hard question to answer.
You're going to have to put some effort into your life. Set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. You need to be motivated to do that. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security.
So now you've got your thing to aim at. Think, well, I'm motivated because I got my thing to aim at. Yeah. It's like you're not as motivated as you could be because you don't yet have your thing to run away from. Because if you really want to be motivated, you want to be going somewhere and you want to be not going somewhere else.
You got to aim at something. Otherwise, your life is meaningless. Well, what should you aim at? Well, pick something. Aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay. But at least it'll change in an informed way. Discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens.
In some sense, life is a game. The analogy is that in life, like in sports, you're setting forth an aim and then arranging your perceptions and your actions in pursuit of that. And that you also generally do it while cooperating and competing with other people. Right. So that's also the game-like element as well.
Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be anxiety-provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. The goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort.
Put yourself in the right frame of mind. Treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. You're someone that you are responsible for helping. So what that means is you have to start from the presupposition that despite all your flaws and insufficiencies, that it's worth having you around and that it would be okay if things were better for you.
It's like if you want to have everything you could possibly want and more, then be a good person. The better a person you are, the more likely that is to happen. That doesn't mean that you're completely protected against getting cut off at the knees. But there's no better strategy.
Then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. It's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously, there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy.
Now it's okay. Now you got your vision. You're trying to get through a territory you don't understand. And here's your option. No map, a map that's not so good but has some things about it, or a great map. Well, right. Obviously the great map is the thing you want, yeah. But the map that's something is way better than the map that's nothing. Plus, as you explore, because of your map, you can start to fill in the details. Let's say you aim at something and you develop some skills along the way, and then you get like a third of the way there and you think, oh, that's not for me. It's like, well, yeah, fair enough. But now you've still got the skills you developed. You know exactly why it's not for you now. And then you can bring that wisdom back, even though it's not perfect, you can bring it back to your next plan. So as you plan, you get better at planning, which is the crucial thing. So then we say to people, take your positive vision and make it into 8 stateable goals, right? So, and then rank them in a hierarchy, break the goals into incremental goals so that you have a reasonable probability of succeeding within some time frame. That's the other thing. You have to parameterize it with regards to time frame. That's right. And when you're in the zone, you're expanding your skills in a manner that's intrinsically rewarding because you're succeeding. And so you want to set, if you're good to yourself, you think, okay, I need to set a goal, but I need to set a goal that someone as stupid and useless as me could probably attain if they put some effort into it. Right. And then you've got it perfectly, because it's not
so high that it's grandiose or impossible that you fail necessarily and then justify your bitterness. Well, I set a goal and I didn't attain it, so I'm not going to set any more goals.
Right.
It's like, no, you set a goal that was inappropriate and you're playing a trick on yourself because you wanted to fail so that you could justify not having to try, which isn't helpful. You're still going to be a victim. It's like, there's no way out of that, man. Yeah. So, because life is a challenge that in some sense can't be surmounted. So there's no way out of your problem. But there are certainly proper ways of dealing with it. And then the next thing is, okay, you need a rationale for them because you're going to have doubts and people are going to put up obstacles. Why would it be good for you? Okay. Why would it be good for your family if you attain that goal? Why would it be good for the broader community? Because if it's a good goal, it should be good for you. That's fine. But if it's a really good goal, it should be good for you in a way that's good for other people.
Win, win, win.
Yes, exactly. And if you're going to decide what your goals are, why not set up the ones that benefit the largest number of people simultaneously? Yeah. Yes. If you can do that, you should start with your own concerns because you have to take care of yourself.
Basic needs first.
Yes. Put your own oxygen mask on, then put your child's oxygen mask on. Yeah. Right. And then you can, as you build up the basis of competence locally, you might develop enough skill so that you can expand that outward. And it also gives your goal a certain amount of nobility. And so if someone challenges you and says, well, why are you doing that? That seems stupid. You could say, I'm doing that because it helps me take care of myself, but it benefits my family, and here's the reasons why, and this is the repercussions out into the broader community. People who are putting up objections and doubts aren't armed to deal with that kind of response. Yeah. And then when you have those doubts in your mind that plague you, you say, why am I doing this? Oh yeah, it's because, well, I have to take care of myself because otherwise I'm pathetic and useless and bitter and cruel. And then I'm going somewhere terrible. So that's a bad idea. And here's how it would help my family. And here's how it would help the community. And that's good enough set of reasons unless I can think of better ones. Right. If without better ones, that's good enough. When the unknown emerges, you tend to experience anxiety. And then there's the known. And I define the known very specifically and very carefully. The known is the place you are when what you're doing produces the results you want. And I say want because that brings motivation and emotion into the game. So you're motivated to pursue something. You pursue it, and what you want happens. Not only do you get what you want, but you get validation for the structure that governs your perceptions and your actions. What you most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing. So in some sense, it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look. And so what they decide is they have the castle, and it's the middle of a forest. And so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you and that you're fond of pursuing and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there and you haven't mastered it. And you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it. And so it has this monstrous aspect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person. And so you don't like conflict and you won't stand up for yourself. And you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And imagine that you're afraid. Maybe you have something like agoraphobia. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you're afraid of. And you don't want to go there. But if you want to put yourself together, then that's exactly where you have to go. And so it's frequently the case that what you want to find is to be found where you least want to find it. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. the dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. So all of that's lurking underneath this, in this imagery of the whale. Now, the whale, you can think of the story of Jonah. What happens with Jonah is that, roughly speaking, he's a prophet, and God tells him that he has to go to this city and straighten it out because it's veered off the path and it's heading towards doom. And Jonah thinks, I'm not going to that city to tell those people anything like that because they're not going to be very happy with me just showing up there and telling them, everything they're doing wrong. And so he hops on a boat and tries to get out of there. And then God conjures up this huge storm and the boat is about to be swamped. And Jonah admits that it's actually his fault because God's upset with him because he got this direct command to go straighten out the city and he ran off. And so they're not happy about this, but they throw Jonah overboard and the seas calm and great fish comes up, a whale, and swallows him. And then he's down in the fish for 3 days and it throws him up on the dry land. And then he's learned his lesson by that time and he goes off to pursue his proper destiny. So that's echoed in this story as well, that if you don't follow the pathway that you're supposed to follow, the seas will become stormy for you and something will come up and pull you down and you'll be in a terrible place for some length of time till you learn your lesson. And if you're lucky, you'll get spit back up on shore and then you can go do what you should do. Well, that's not a lesson that anybody needs to have interpreted. I think everybody understands that. Anyways, the cricket tells Pinocchio what he has to do. And then something kind of paradoxical happens. Pinocchio decides he's going to go do this. And then the cricket has got this weird paradoxical response to that. On the one hand, he's sort of pulling Pinocchio back, saying, look, this is foolhardy. That you're going to go all the way down to the ocean. You're going to confront this terrible whale. This is really, really dangerous. But at the same time, when Pinocchio's on the edge of the cliff, the cricket helps him tie his tail around a rock, and he holds his finger in place so that Pinocchio can tie the knot. It's like the conscience is conflicted about this. It's really dangerous and foolhardy, but it's also necessary. And so he plays this dual role. But Pinocchio's leading at this point, so into the ocean he goes. I guess partly what this means is that if you're not oriented properly in the world, you should take your doubts and the chaos that you're enveloped in seriously. You should face it and think it through. You should go into it as far as you can go into it, because maybe you'll find something at the bottom of it. The alternative is to pretend that it doesn't exist. This idea in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation. And Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be. And that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximal development. Now, it sounds like a metaphysical idea or a mystical idea even, but it's not. It's not. It's a really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, there's nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case? Unless there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that is what the situation would be. It's kind of interesting to think about how that would be manifest moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that lead you down the path of development. Well, that better be the case. Okay, so that's fine. And so there's some utility in pursuing those things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. And the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, what the hell do you know? you might be interested in things that are kind of warped and bent. And often it's the case that when new parts of people manifest themselves and grip their interests, say, they do it very badly and shoddily. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is the precursor to the savior from the symbolic perspectives, because you have to be a fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be a fool, then you can't be a master. So you're going to, it's an error-ridden process. And that's also laid out in the Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens to all these patriarchal figures when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84 is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social and some of it's natural and some of it's a consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So they're fools. But the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're fools, they're still supposed to go on the adventure, and that they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this. So this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual circling, in some sense, of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely. Highly likely. So Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked, because he thought of stupidity as being it's you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. So that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way. But then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with. And now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? There's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes they disappear. There's a great TED Talk, I think it was, about this guy set up a really advanced computational recording system in his home and recorded every single utterance his young child made while learning to speak. And then he put together the child's attempts to say certain phonemes and put them in a list, and you can hear the child deviating madly to begin with, and then after hundreds and hundreds of repetitions, just zeroing right in on the exact phoneme. So you might not know this, but when kids babble, because they start babbling when they're quite young, they babble every human phoneme, including all sorts of phonemes that adults can't say. And then they die into their language, so that after they learn, say, English, then there's all sorts of phonemes they can no longer hear or pronounce. But to begin with, it's all there, which is really quite interesting. But as they learn a particular language, they zero in on the proper way to pronounce that, and their errors minimize. And every time you learn something, that's how it is. And that's really useful to know, too, because it means that it's okay to wander around stupidly before you fix your destination. Now, you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens is that the Hebrews escape a tyranny, which is kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidly held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you'd think, well, now I'm on the way. It's no, you're not. Now you're in the desert where you wander around stupidly, and worship the wrong things until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that's worth knowing too, because you think, well, I got rid of a lot of things, excess baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything's okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffolds that were keeping you in place, even though they were pathological. And now you have nothing. And nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, but you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It's that you escape from a tyranny. It's, hooray, we're no longer slaves. Yeah, well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement. It's also useful to know that, because you can also be deluded into the idea that, imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all those parts of you on that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just a linear pathway uphill. It's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like, here you are, and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a complete bloody catastrophe. It's worse. And then maybe you can pull yourself together, and you hit a new plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes, and bang, it's worse again. And so, because part of the reason that people don't become enlightened is because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. Let's say if you have to get out of a bad relationship. There isn't any relationship that's 100% bad. And so when you jump out of it, well, maybe you're in better shape, but you're still lonesome and disoriented, and you don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with the devil they know instead of, looking for the devil they don't know. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful.
Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to be enrolled, each to his own city.
And Joseph went up from Galilee, out of the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was great with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Then Luke 2, 8-20. In the same region, there were shepherds abiding in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And lo, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were very afraid. But the angel said to them, "Be not afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this is how you shall know him. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." All right, so there's a variety of things happening there. I'll unpack them briefly, and then we can discuss them. So the first is that Christ is born under the dominion of the state. That's the point of the census and the forced movement of people. The state has a tyrannical element. Every person, even the Savior of the world, is born into a situation where they have to contend with the background tyranny of the state. And then the next part is that...
And Augustus is the first God emperor. It's important to understand.
Right. So that's amplified, that fact, right? Because the Roman state is also degenerating towards a theocracy, right? Okay.
Isn't he called Weos Tuteu? Because he's the son of Julius Caesar.
So
he's the son of the god.
Exactly right. So he would be, on all the coins, you'd have
Weos Tuteu.
Filios Divi, and in the Greek-speaking part of the world, where the Roman imperial cult, the cult of the emperor, was very, very strong, that's the language that was used.
So we have the genuine God being born at a time when there's a false God who's emerged in the tyrannical state. That's a classic hero story. Okay, so who's the true God here? Well, it's a babe, right? So is that every human baby with the potential to participate in the redemption of the world, born in a very lowly place? Well, that's a biological reality as well, because all human infants are incredibly threatened, right? Our infants are extremely dependent. They're very, very vulnerable. We're born under the tyranny of the state. We're born in relationship to nature and even low nature, and that's associated with the manger. So it's the emergence of the highest in the lowest as a counterposition to the false highest that's Augustus. And then that's reiterated to some degree with the proclamation to the shepherds. It's like, well, who gets wind of this? Well, it's not the people of the court. It's the shepherds, right? And the shepherds are an interesting choice too, because of course shepherds, there's a kinship between the shepherd and the prophet all the way through the Old Testament, and that imagery is replicated continually in the New Testament. And shepherds take care of the vulnerable. That's essentially what they do, and they do that independently and responsibly. And so even though they're lowly, they're not, because they're types of something much greater. And even though they are low on the socioeconomic totem pole, the fact that Christ's birth is announced to them is an indication of the universally salvific nature of his birth and mission, right? So that's all happening in those.
And the shepherds are also counter to city, like, because they're the opposite of civilization. They have these flocks, they move around, they don't stay in one place, they don't have agriculture, they don't have all the things, all the tropes of the city.
It's also an answer for the undeniable. In a way, it's the reversal of the cone, right? If a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? If the Son of God is born in a manger and there's only shepherds around, is he still the Son of God? And the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Just 2 points.
Great things from lowly beginning.
Just about Augustus and as it were, the fragile or endangered state of the child. Augustus is also the emperor in this period of extraordinary stability for the Roman Empire. So it's also a good time for Jesus to be born, because
Pax Romana.
Exactly. So I think there's the tyrant element, the false deity, but also it's auspicious. And the second point about his vulnerability, but again, the emphasis on David, right? This is the Davidic house, so it's in a manger. The there's no room in the inn, but the emphasis again, this is the true successor of David.
Yeah, and I don't think Augustus is just the tyrannical. Augustus is the ending of a civilization-wide civil war,
Yeah.
and I think there's an attempt to indicate something like a kairos happening here.
That's interesting, yeah.
Right? Right. Yeah. You've got. I'm not denying the tyranny of the Roman emperor, but Augustus. Many historians consider him maybe the greatest emperor, right? And
if God had to choose any period in history to leave his authenticating signature on the world in a way that would disseminate and distribute that message as quickly as possible, it's hard to pick a better time than
and so it's like if you introduced it's almost like an enzyme. Like what's the state in which this action can be most fruitful? And so in a time when everything's filled with sin, he sends the flood. In a time when things have a level of stability and there needs to be foundations through which to rise up to condemn him. Because in utter chaos, you can't have so cleanly that the temple and the government, like every aspect of the culture fails him, so they have to be in place in order to render that judgment.
It's hard to imagine the Christian message spreading with the astonishing speed that it does from, say, the early 30s AD to the point where, by 64, there are enough Christians in Rome for Nero to be able to scapegoat the Christians as a distinct group from the Jews. So all the conditions are.
But there is a desire to create a foil, though, I think, because even if we talk about the Pax Romana, we haven't gotten to the right after that when the angels announce, they say, glory to God in the highest, peace on earth of men of goodwill, right? It's trying to say, I think it is creating a foil to the Roman rule, which is, here's the great emperor, without maybe not necessarily criticizing, but here's the great emperor, here's this piece, but now here's the true emperor that's hidden at the bottom of the world in a cave, in a manger, this is through this that the true peace will be found.
That's the language of an imperial edict. And in fact, actually, it's worth pointing out that the Greek word for good news or gospel is evangelion, which is the word that emperors would send out. Often if it was the emperor's birthday, you would send the evangelion to the towns and villages that worshipped him. And this was particularly in this part of the world. And this was the good news of the emperor of Caesar's birthday. So there's clearly, I think, a semi-conscious aping and mimicking of the language of the imperial cult to assert that Jesus is Lord and therefore Caesar is.
Christ is a master at using short, mysterious stories. They change the listener who takes them seriously.
The person that you do not think could ever be virtuous. Well, let me show you. This is the person who is fulfilling the law and the prophets.
I don't believe in that promise. I'll just be honest on this point.
Then it hit me. I saw it.
This Jew is very frightened of a post-Christian society.
The power of love.
I don't want to be in a Hallmark card, I tell you.
We've got our work cut out for us, gentlemen. I sure hope we're up to the task.
I think it's a formula that in some ways sums up the whole Bible. Glory to God in the highest and peace among us. That's how it works. When you give glory to something other than God, then violence breaks out and division breaks out. But if you really give glory to the summum bonum appropriately, then peace will obtain among us. So the angelic message is that's the whole Bible.
It's the whole Bible, that's for sure. I totally agree.
And some of that's associated with the glorification of the infant, right? as a center of attention, which is a proper center of attention. Right.
But it also has to be, for it to be the fullness, you also have to have these extremes where the angels appear above, these singing angels, right? The music of the spheres, and then the lowest aspect of reality being connected together so that you say, oh, this is the fullness of God's revelation, the fullness of God's presence in the world, represented by these two extremes with the angels up above.
But what is the Greek again for we say host or we say company of angels, but it's like something with army, like stratias or strategic.
I can't remember the Hebrew is army.
Pardon me?
The Hebrew is army.
Yeah. Right. So, what I find so fascinating, so Caesar can dominate the world because he's got this big human army. But in fact, the baby king has the real army. It's an angelic army of these fearsome supernatural realities. So who's going to win this battle? The baby king's going to win.
So, Bishop, I have a question, which I know a lot of people watching this will have. But I have it too. I agree 100% if we all acknowledge the God of the Bible, it would be a much better world, even a peaceful world. So how do you explain, because it's a very real question for all of us, not just people who claimed to believe in God who did horrible things, but horrible things to other people who believed in God. The Christian wars in Europe probably precipitated the rejection of religion ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, and I really am curious. It's not a provocative question. It's in fact, the first book I wrote is called The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, and one of the 9 questions is, if religion, specifically Judaism, is supposed to make people good, how do you account for unethical religious Jews? It's one of the 9 questions I asked in my first book. The question of people who believe in God who do bad, I mean the God of the Bible, that's all I'm talking about, is a very real one.
Dennis, let's let that hang and get that back into that when we talk about the Pharisees.
I'm not sure they're the best example of bad guys.
No, but I think the question is specifically addressed in some of the stories of Christ's conflict, let's say, with religious authorities per se. And I think we should address that.
It has to do with hypocrisy.
Yeah.
The idea of saying one thing and doing another. Like, that's the opposite of the incarnation. Right? It's like, it's this disjoining of heaven and earth where you have a word and a being that aren't connected. You say things, you think something, you say something, and then you do another thing. Where Christ is saying, no, heaven and earth have to be united. That is what the incarnation is trying to show.
We'll spend a whole session on that question in some ways. Okay, so I'm going to go through the lead up to the baptism here, and we'll conclude with that. So what happens in the next few stories, essentially, and I'll compress them, is that Mary and Joseph and the people around Christ are presented with evidence of various sorts that something particularly special is going on here. So we first of all have the naming and events in the temple when Jesus is presented in the temple, and there's a prophetess there who describes his eventual destiny, and a prophet there too, Simeon. And so he tells Mary that her son is destined to do spectacular things. And then after that, we have the gifts of the Magi. And these are magicians, Magi, from the East, who have analyzed the patterns of the stars in heaven because they're astrologers, and have determined that an old age has ended, and that would be the age of the ram, and a new age, Pisces, is about to begin. And so there's signs in the stars, so to speak, that something new is about to be born. And the Magi come and find Christ and represent and regard him as the fulfillment of their prophetic intuition. And so that's another. And then we have the parallel. This is a Old Testament parallel with the flight into Egypt and massacre of the innocents. Do you want to speak about that?
Sure. I mean, the interesting thing about the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents is, the story of Jesus is always smashing the Old Testament references together, bringing them together in a way that is absolutely crazy. And so what happens is when Jesus goes to Egypt, he's doing the flight and return from Egypt at the same time. That is, when Joseph goes to Egypt, he flees his brothers trying to kill him. When Moses leaves Egypt with the Israelites, he's fleeing the Pharaoh that tried to kill the children of Israel. And so in this version, the two come together in one story. And there's a third element too, which is also King David fleeing King Saul, who the true king fleeing the king that is there at this moment. So you have this wild image where, the Christ goes into Egypt in order to flee the king in both ways, like fleeing his own brother, but then also fleeing the tyrant Pharaoh. It's hard even to say it because all the images kind of come together. But we talked about this in Exodus. It's a difficult situation because in some ways it has to do with the problem of the one, and it's right. It has to do with the problem of the concentration of a generation into one person. it's a little scandalous to talk about it, but I think that is part of what is happening.
So the Magi tell Herod that a king will arise, and Herod determines to kill all the
babies.
Right, all the babies. And so that's equivalent to what happens in Moses' time. And it's another echoing of the idea.
And also Joseph. Like Joseph leaving his brothers that want to kill him into Egypt, but then also Moses leaving Egypt into the promised land. Those two get smashed into one image.
There's also, there's extra biblical reference. They're magi. They're plausibly from, they're Zoroastrians.
Right.
And there's been an ongoing relationship between Israel and Persia. And Persia figures I believe I read somewhere that Cyrus was actually one of the first people called Messiah in the Old Testament and King of Kings. And so there's also that relationship to, and Zoroastrianism is the idea that that the future has an openness to it, and we are a moral battleground in which that openness can be decided. And I think by having the Magi there is a recognition of that.
But there's also the intimation that's been presented right from the beginning, and it will be continually presented, which is that it is related to the story of Joseph, something like the stranger will recognize him first, like that this will move towards the strangers.
But it's the opposite also of the Old Testament, because the Persians send the Jews, but now the Persians come, right? It's also an inversion, which is trying to say, I think there's something happening about the relationship to the Zoroastrian tradition that's being talked about here in an important way. And they are magi, and that's really important.
It's deeply Israelite that Israel is chosen, but not for their own sake, but chosen for the sake of the nations. To your earlier point, that ultimately, that the whole world's come to Torah. Well, you find it in the Psalms, you find it in Isaiah. From a Christian standpoint, here's the beginning of it: that as Christ comes, the other nations get interested
shepherds and
right away.
foreigners are the people
they want to
market.
come and see him.